welcome everybody. We're really excited to have you here today. Today we're hosting the Carbon180 Entrepreneur in Residence to talk about their experience and their interests and their curiosities. As you know, that entrepreneurship is a key part of growing this industry. We have some established companies, but we also need more ideas, more creativity, more creation. So really pleased to have everybody here. We're joined by Kristin and Aaron, who are the Carbon180 Entrepreneur in Residence, and by Peter, who helps run the program at Carbon180, and Jason, who's going to be moderating the discussion. One thing to add, today's event is carbon negative because it's we've purchased carbon removal credits from a company called Carbon Cure. They were part of the Stripe program and the Stripe panel that we had a couple of weeks ago. So we're really excited about that. It's great to be able to make this event carbon negative. That comes through people buying those $10 tickets that you saw. And I should note that our big conference in May was carbon negative, thanks to carbon removal by Climeworks. So we've got Climeworks and Carbon Cure, who are all partnering to help make these digital events carbon negative. And with that, it's great to see you all here. And I'm going to hand it off to Jason, who's our moderator for today.
Thanks, Tito, and welcome everyone. Glad to see you're all here, and greetings from the beautiful city of Seattle with the Space Needle and Mount Rainier. So happy to be here and moderating the event. Thank you to Peter Miner and Kristin Ellis and Aaron Fitzgerald for joining us today. Looking forward to a instructive and interesting conversation about entrepreneurship in this space, some of the advice, pitfalls, and successes that people can think about. As Tito mentioned, the idea is to think about how we can encourage entrepreneurship in carbon removal, and to that end, we've got a great host of panelists. So with that, I'll introduce Peter Miner, who's the fellowship manager for Carbon180.
Thank you, Jason. Great to see everyone here. My name is Peter, and I work at Carbon180. We're a nonprofit organization that is rethinking carbon, and really what that means is that we want to support innovators, policymakers, really anyone who wants to push forward the carbon removal industry. So as part of our mission, we run an entrepreneur in residence program where we want to enable people who have been entrepreneurs previously in other disciplines, but now want to do something in climate change because they feel the need to take action right now. And so we give them a 12-month funded runway where we help them learn about carbon removal, help them identify a pathway that they'd like to build on top of, and then give them all the resources they need to now build a scalable business on top of it. So I'm very excited to introduce two of our EIR fellows who are going to be having a conversation with all of you today. So the first is Kristin. You want to wave or something, Kristin? So people can see. Hi, Kristin. So Kristin is a biologist. She's a community builder and an open source enthusiast. She has a ton of experience building technology for customers in biotechnology, most recently as the director of strategic initiatives at OpenTrons, but is now taking this biology expertise into the climate change field and is thinking about how she can apply her knowledge to move forward carbon removal in a big way. Also excited to introduce Aaron Fitzgerald. So Aaron started his career as a staffer at the US Senate, so started on the policy side, but got the entrepreneurial itch and went on to found 3 different companies, including one that was building technology for climate change. So Aaron is now thinking about ways to take his experience with point source emissions and industrial technologies to build something in carbon removal. So excited to hear more from these two. I'll pass it to both of you to introduce yourselves and talk about how you got into climate change as an industry. Kristin, do you want to maybe get started?
Sure, yeah. So hi, everybody. Really excited to see so many people here, and thanks for joining us. Let's see. Yeah, like Peter said, I have a very broad-ranging background. One of my characteristics is that I'm interested in everything. I've kind of built up a career as more of a generalist, which is kind of perfect for entrepreneurship, which I didn't realize at the start, but I'm kind of stepping into that now. And one of the things that got me interested in carbon removal and in the climate space was actually, it was a conference that I attended. I actually started thinking about this well before this, but in late 2018, I attended a conference where there were companies who were building materials out of new biology, right? So using bioengineering and new biology to build some of the same products that we use every day that we're used to creating from petrochemicals or from ancient biology, right? So I kind of had this moment of like, everything in the world right now, from, you know, most of the energy we produce to a lot of the materials that we use are made from biology. It's just ancient biology. And so what if we could use newer biology and non-extractive processes and make that those supply chains a little bit more cyclical and make them a little bit better for the environment and make sure that we're restoring things along the way. And so that sort of just captured my imagination. I mean, you've got people that are growing concrete from microbes and making Yeezys out of algal foam, you know, like it's just, there's just a very broad range of possibilities when you merge bioengineering, biotechnology, and carbon removal. And so that's what really sparked my interest in the space. And I thought about it for a long time and was trying to figure out how to get in and really start working on it full time. And fortunately, Carbon180 announced this program, and extra fortunately, they accepted me into it. And so I've spent the last 4 months really churning on some of those ideas, right? So what are some of the places where bioengineering and biotechnology can be used to accelerate or enhance carbon removal and or emissions reduction? So that's me. That's what I'm interested in.
I guess I'm up.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter, for the introduction, and Tito, Jason, and the greater AirMiners community for having us here. If I had to talk about how I got into this space, I think that'd be a really long story, but I guess I can start off by saying I think some of my kind of grit, scrappiness, and that can-do attitude really plays a big part. And then also growing up in poverty and kind of some of the challenges that associated with that. Early on, I had to learn how to be a problem solver. And when I took that, moving that more into like a professional environment, I haven't necessarily followed a linear path, but I started my career in politics where I thought I could have a high impact, helping to improve the lives of the American people. I quickly realized that politics wasn't that change agent that was right for me. So I took the less common path of a former Hill staffer and went into entrepreneurship. And generally, I found that I love the work of entrepreneurship, even if that doesn't necessarily mean the business outcomes are how you envision them to be. So in between this current fellowship that I'm participating in with Carbon180 and shutting down my last company, I took a sabbatical. And just generally, if you all have been entrepreneurs, sometimes you just need a break from startup land. And I was able to catch up on some of the news that I had missed. And I became really curious and involved in some of the global efforts we were doing to reduce our greenhouse gases, and was pretty upset by the lack of action there. And then being a tech geek, I recall being really drawn towards learning about some of the market readiness for emissions reduction technologies. And I always thought that that would be a really interesting ability to kind of go in and develop market-based solutions for the climate crisis, but never thought with my background, not being a technical, that would be a right fit for me. But shortly after, an opportunity presented itself. I think if you keep going down a path and you're asking questions, that's just kind of how you create opportunities. And I was able to join a company called Kairos Aerospace, and they focus on aerial methane imaging. And it was during that time that I was able to kind of test and more effectively applied a lot of the founder skills that I learned from my past ventures. I also realized that I could learn an area of science that was completely new to me. And I think most importantly, it kind of gave me the confidence to realize that my skills, which center in commercialization on that side of like the climate of the puzzle, also have value in this like young but essential climate space. So when I left Kairos, I knew I wanted to further scale my impact, but I didn't necessarily have a plan on how I was going to do that. But I knew I was a little angry. We had conducted aerial methane surveys over landfills. So from a visual perspective, I saw how leaky these facilities were. But it wasn't until I left Kairos that I had the opportunity to kind of like think about and be curious as to what could be done about the physical removal of that methane and the carbon dioxide that's part of landfill gas. As I became curious, I think that's kind of the day I would say that I kind of became an air miner, and that I started contacting facilities, contacting research institutions to kind of just learn what could be done. And along the way, I've been able to, I think, partner with some great companies like Carbon180 as an EIR. I had the opportunity to work with Lawrence Livermore National Labs, and now I'm also working with NREL.
Great. Great. Thank you for the detailed description of how you got here and what your backgrounds were. Thinking a little bit about the program you're in right now, what are your, in general, what are your objectives with the fellowship? What do you aim to achieve by participating in the program?
Do you want me to take that, Kristin? I can go first.
Yeah.
Well, I think well, part of being an entrepreneur is having the runway to be able to fail. And I think when you're in such a challenging space, you particularly when you're talking about physically removing atmospheric gases, you don't really have an opportunity to get things wrong like you can building software companies. And the from technology to market to commercialization just takes a longer time. So throughout this year, I think being able to investigate multiple technologies, different processes, and different ways of going about carbon reduction is just such a powerful kind of environment to be in. And then learning from folks with different backgrounds from mine, Kristin, the other 5 EIRs has just been so helpful in filling in some of the gaps that I personally had when it comes to this space.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to second the having the runway to fail. That's very, very important to me. I mean, so there's this kind of idea that, like, I don't know, I guess the thing I really want to say is, like, I don't know how many other people feel like they are lost a lot of the time, especially in this space, because it's so new in terms of the technology. But I don't actually know how to do this. Like, there's not a good roadmap. There's not a playbook for air mining, for carbon removal. And so everybody that's moving into this space right now is going to have an uphill battle and is going to have a really hard time figuring out what to do. So one of the appeals of this program was, wow, like, if I were able to do this, I could spend full time for at least a year, get the runway to fail, get the runway to really connect with experts in the space, people who know more than me, which is most people, and kind of figure out, okay, what are the current things that people are working on? What does the landscape look like? What are the opportunities? I think one of the most incredible things I've learned through this program, also working with NREL to assess some of their portfolio technologies and talking to some of the entrepreneurs who have already moved into this space, is that it's very greenfield. It's kind of a yes and. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of opportunities to make an impact in carbon removal and or emissions reduction. And I wanted to be one of the people moving into that space. So that's one of the big things that compelled me to to actually join this program, was kind of being able to hit the gas on that learning cycle and potentially do it a lot faster. A lot of the process has been learning a lot from a lot of people who came before me and trying to figure out how can we creatively borrow and leverage existing infrastructure and existing systems and existing technologies, because they are out there, and create something that can have an impact sooner. One of the things that we talk about is that there are no silver bullets, but I do dream, like one of my big aspirations is I want to build a technology that within 10 years, you know, build a company around a technology that within 10 years is potentially displacing a gigaton of carbon per year out of, you know, either through emissions reductions or actual carbon removal, but taking that out of the equation. That's a big ask. It's really hard to project from where I'm sitting today to that moment, especially if I'm looking at one technology or even sometimes 2 or 3 technologies in tandem. So I think another thing I'll add is that it's the opportunity to connect with a community of people who are all interested in taking a crack at this problem and working on it together. I have never done anything alone in my life. I don't consider myself like a solopreneur, although I am spending a lot of my time working alone right now. And so that collaboration is really, really fundamental and really important to me. It's going to take everybody doing this together. I want all the jobs to be climate jobs. That's kind of my long-term goal.
Great, great. What would you say the biggest learning has been so far for each of you?
Who's the biggest? I don't know. Aaron, do you want to go first again?
Sure. I mean, let's see. It's a good question. You know, I think this space is such a constant discovery for me, and particularly I'm learning something new every day with every conversation I have. My understanding of just like why things are how they are, why change has been so slow, and even just I think some of the other questions that kind of bring us all here today just kind of evolves. But I think like generally probably my biggest learnings fall into about 3 categories, and these are kind of perhaps maybe a bit more practical. Really looking at technology to market, the carbon removal market itself, as Kristin kind of alluded to, and then different opportunities in it. If I start with the tech to market, I think one thing I've learned is that there are a lot of like really promising technologies at pilot scale maturity and beyond. But there's some bottlenecks in getting that technology to market anytime you're talking about hardware. And that gap is primarily in funding. And if you're talking about commercializing like these high risk technologies with a lot of CapEx, your pathways for capitalization are pretty limited. You're talking about well-stacked kind of mission-driven foundations or government grants. So I think in terms of like my learning there, Carbon180 has been such a resource. They're very integral in getting appropriation funds for R&D through Congress. So if you see like, so being able to bridge that gap, I think is starting to get smaller. And then in terms of, so you're an entrepreneur, maybe you've identified your technology or your area that you want to focus in. And then you're talking about the carbon removal market in and of itself. As Kristin mentioned, it's a green field, but honestly, there's a lot, at least my discovery has been that there's a lot more infrastructure than I initially thought. You're not necessarily starting from scratch. You know, carbon removal has been around for decades in some form of fashion. Oil and gas, you know, is an industry that's very familiar with it, in addition to having being one of the largest, contributors to emissions. So, but there are also plenty of other use cases when it comes to carbon removal. And some of those limiting factors that I think make it really hard to adopt technology, be it technology readiness, politics and regulatory, financing and industry. I think some of those layers are starting to be peeled back, and as more people are knocking on the doors, to some of these kind of gatekeepers, they can't necessarily ignore the call, and we're breaking down those boundaries. And then I think the last bit is really the opportunities there. Being in a green field is pretty amazing as an entrepreneur, but also really overwhelming at times. Just the sheer number of solutions that haven't been market tested is pretty astounding to me. And I feel like there are about 1,000 ideas that I want to go through, and that I could potentially turn into companies and test. But and ultimately, if I was able to do that, the cost of carbon capture would be significantly lower. But I would say that because there's just so many different opportunities there, and if you feel like you have an idea, it might not be the right one at the start, but I think it's enough to jump off, and if you have that curiosity to just kind of follow through and see where it goes.
Great. And Kristin, feel free to chime in with what your biggest learnings have been. One follow-up, though, maybe to both Aaron and you, Kristin, is you touched on this a little bit, Aaron, but how is your perception of the greenhouse gas carbon removal field changed as a result of your activities so far?
Well, I really want everyone who's on this call, who's interested in becoming an entrepreneur, to jump in. So, but I'm also going to be really honest. This is very difficult work. And I don't always feel like I have the right tools. Kristin and I have bi-weekly calls. I'm not speaking for her, but I feel like sometimes you feel like you don't have all the right tools because there is no playbook to this. So just when you're, and when you're kind of knocking on all those different stakeholders' doors, everyone has they're all stakeholders, and they have their own incentives and drivers for why things haven't happened or why change is slow. Mm-hmm. And that can be discouraging. And when you're coming at this from, look, there are easier ways to make money. So, if you're not coming at this from passion, like it can be really difficult. So, I'm so passionate about this, and I just want it to happen like yesterday, that, being able to manage my own personal expectations and where I should be and where things are has just been a challenge. But I think it goes back to that kind of market, the carbon market in and of itself. There are companies out here who are kind of paving the way, and there are people out here who are thinking about this and who want you to be successful. So just making sure you build a community, making sure you're involved in communities like AirMiners is important.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that. A big part of the struggle, and this is something that we have monthly meetings with Peter as well. And so one of the things that I'm always talking about with Peter is I'm like, Peter, I feel so lost. Like, and it's like, I'm wayfinding, right? I'm like lost still. I was lost at the beginning. I'm still lost. I'm lost in a different place. It's not like I haven't gone anywhere, but that thing where there's no playbook and there's no roadmap, and you don't necessarily know which tools exist and which ones don't, and what's missing and what's not. That's all very overwhelming. It can be very confusing. It can be very difficult. But one of the things I've learned is that, like, okay, fine. So like we live in a capitalist society, and we are entrepreneurs, and we are trying to build businesses, and money is a necessary part of that. But there are a lot of people, and this is a thing that I've learned that really honestly makes me feel better about this field than many other technological fields that I've looked at, is that people are interested in thinking about not just innovations in technology, but innovations in business models, innovations in how do we make sure that we're not creating climate billionaires, that we're not concentrating a disproportionate amount of wealth to a smaller and smaller group of people, as we have seen happen. I had a lot of conflicts about becoming an entrepreneur in this space. I'm not convinced all the time that more entrepreneurship and more capital is the answer to where like the sort of unequal and irresponsible deployment of capital has gotten us to date. But I do think that there's a real opportunity here to, as Erin said, build community, connect with people who are passionate and care a lot about this, and want to build better. And I think that's been one of the most inspiring things, and one of the things I've learned. I kind of came into it hoping that it wouldn't be, you know, more standard tech tropes, because I'm very used to those. And refreshingly, I found that there are a lot of people in this space that are just really committed to doing the hard work right now and getting it off the ground. And that's really helpful. Like, it's really inspiring. It helps me keep going when I have those hard days where I'm like, I'm lost and I have no idea what I'm doing. I've also learned that there's a lot that needs to be done in every sector. So it's not just the technology, it's like our understanding of life cycle analyses, of carbon accounting, of how exactly you're assigning a price per ton to a carbon credit or a carbon removal solution. All of that is still kind of messy. It's a bit like the Wild West. And there are a lot of people in this space who, like, there's not an answer. I can't go and say, this is how I do the economic analysis, life cycle analysis of this technology, and say it's going to be this much carbon at this scale and this many dollars per ton. We're going to be having to kind of make a lot of that up as we go along too, which is something that makes this space a lot harder to work in. But framed another way, it's also an opportunity to make it look the way we want to make it look, and kind of keep an eye on what are the policymakers talking about? How can we have conversations with them and influence them? What are the entrepreneurs talking about? How can we have conversations with them and influence them? What are regular people who are aware of climate change and working in their communities on shoring up their food security and reframing the way they interact with the ecology around them? What are they thinking about? How can we learn from them? So I think there's a lot of good faith and a lot of passion and a lot of optimism in this space. So yeah,
I agree. It's one of the things I personally find very compelling about the area of carbon removal. When you mentioned that you feel lost, I'm going to come out as a Lord of the Rings geek here, but you know, not all who wander are lost. So, which makes me wonder, which actually also leads to a question: you know, how do you find that center from which you can navigate what might be stormy seas? Because I've heard the same from I've heard the similar from other people doing entrepreneurship elsewhere, that sometimes it's difficult to find sort of those touchstones, but knowing like what those centering principles are can really help.
Oh, wow. It's a hard question too. I think I look towards community. So the other fellows are definitely kind of anchors for me. We're talking about an industry that is grounded in science. So, making sure things are actually, scientifically feasible. And then, even though I think we've seen the government just kind of create money out of thin air, and I think that what we've done with the coronavirus, we could also do with carbon removal and the climate crisis. Making sure things are also grounded in economics is important. That's, I think, probably the hardest, at least for me, is finding those right solutions that really fit those kind of techno-economic lens has been a challenge. And when I do feel discouraged, I just kind of lean back on community. Peter gets a lot of Slack messages from me, and I'm sure he probably gets annoyed, but it's just kind of part of it all. We're all humans. We're all partially responsible for what's going on, and I think just kind of also reminding myself that this has been something, this has been going on longer than I've been alive, right? And like these solutions should have happened in tandem with the development of our economy, but they haven't. And so we're coming in at the time when we are in crisis mode, and remembering that this is, I think a climate pandemic in of itself helps me stay grounded and kind of reminds me that, these are crazy times, and during crazy times, you need to lean on people who you trust and who also believe in you. So that's really important for me.
Mm-hmm. For me, it's like, first of all, like Peter's great and has been really helpful through this process. I can't like plus one enough the idea that community and talking to other people. I've had conversations with Jason and Tito and Aaron and Peter and so many other people that I'm sure are also on this call that have really helped me to feel less. I know this isn't a useful way to frame this, but help me feel a little less crazy, or a little less like I'm losing my grip on things, because it's very easy to get overwhelmed, especially when I'm looking at, okay, like it's kind of easier for me to visualize kind of a near-term, small-scale path to market for a lot of the technologies that I'm looking at, particularly biotechnologies. Much, much harder to envision the scale, both from an impact perspective and from the perspective of, is this something that you can responsibly scale and not be making the problem worse? And one of the very useful things that Peter has said to me a couple of times is, it's like, of course, that's a struggle. Of course, you're having a hard time. Not only are we working in this very hard field that's very new, and there's not a playbook and nobody knows what they're doing, but there's also a global pandemic going on. There's also a very large amount of necessary but really difficult socio-political upheaval happening. And so just thinking about it in terms of wayfinding, it's what is the next right thing that I can do? So it's like, okay, fine. So I can't imagine 3 months from now, or 6 months from now, or a year from now, or even 5 years from now in any kind of substantial way. But I know what I'm working on today and what I'm trying to learn about. And so for the next 2 hours, what is the thing that I can do to move that ball forward? And through those short iterative steps, I'm only gonna, like, later with the crystal ball of hindsight, be able to look back and say, oh, that's how I got here. But, putting less emphasis on projecting forward this like perfect vision of the future, and just trying to figure out what is the next right thing that I can be doing literally right now, has been honestly really useful, really practical. It's helped me to actually get things done in the midst of all of the upheaval right now. And so, yeah, community, and then just like staying focused on what's 2 feet in front of my face instead of 2 years down the road. Those are 2 things that are just like indispensable right now.
Great. So we are going to open it up to Q&A from the audience shortly. So if you have any questions to anyone on the Zoom, feel free to add them to the general Zoom chat and message everybody, and we'll take a look and hopefully get to everyone before the top of the hour. One question that came up, actually directed to Aaron. Could you talk a little bit more about what kind of tools are missing to make the process of entrepreneurship more efficient?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question. I think coming from software, and then even at Kairos, we were selling data. There was a hardware component to it, but the commercial aspect of it was selling data to oil and gas operators. there's just a lot more infrastructure there. There's a lot more opportunity to experiment and fail quicker and faster. But in terms of tools, I think like to be an entrepreneur in this space, you have a couple kind of core things you need. You need a technology. You need good techno-economics, which is this. So you need a techno-economic analyses. You need good life cycle analyses. So these are all, and what goes into that is a lot. I'm not a chemical engineer, so it's process design and process modeling, and then being able to talk to manufacturers of equipment to model out the cost. And that there's a lot of work that goes into that. And there are some really good organizations that have been helpful at being able to create guides for practitioners. I think of the CO2 initiative when I think of that. And then when it comes to the life cycle analyses, like really figuring out where you fit into the value chain. I think that, if you're looking to sell a physical product, what's the end of your product? Where does it end up? Are all considerations that if you are coming from a software background, you don't necessarily think about, right? Like I never thought about shutting my company down and where in the Amazon web server is going to, exist. But that is the case if I were to, build a physical product or it's just like, I think there's a lot of considerations that go into building businesses here that I have had to learn and expand in my horizons. And I think those two tools are probably, the most topical for this conversation. Trying to think of other ones, Kristin. Anything else that I miss?
I don't think so. I mean, the thing that came to mind for me is definitely more of the life cycle analysis stuff, because it's like we're used to like, I say we, but it's like if you're used to building a business specifically around a physical product, which I have done, you are thinking about like unit economics and economies of scale, and how do I get from, a big part of my last job was, okay, well, how am I going to get from a production line that can crank out 10 robots a month to one that can do 20 robots a month to one that can do 60 robots a week, right? And so there are certain unit economics you look at, different economies of scale you look at as you're kind of envisioning and modeling like the path to get there. And one of the tools that I'm trying to add to my toolbox is adding into that kind of economic analysis and modeling process is like, what is the actual, like, how do I estimate the impact this is having in a quantitative, how many tons of carbon is moving through this cycle perspective? That is something that is very dependent on the technology that you're using. And say, even if you're attaching something to a point source, you might be creating other emissions or creating other byproducts that are harmful. And so trying to figure out like, what is the correct way to scope that? Again, it's kind of the Wild West, and there's not a standard or an agreed upon way to do those things. But that is something that is like fundamentally very important to be thinking about if I'm thinking about which technology do I want to deploy into this space. And so that's something where I very quickly realized, like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't have the tools for this. Does anyone else have the tools for this? And that it's not to say that there aren't certain pathways that have been built and certain answers to some of these questions. But there's not a playbook. There's not a comprehensive thing where I can go and point and say, this is how you do a life cycle analysis on the amount of carbon consumed and emitted by X industrial process. And so we're kind of building that into the imagining of these businesses as well.
Yeah, yeah. That leads to a question that came up from looks like Nikki at X Prize, who wanted to know what would be your wish list of new tools in supporting infrastructure, policies, research initiatives, or programs that would make it easier to start and scale carbon removal startups. I think you spoke a little bit to that, but
you cut out for a second.
oh, sure. Can you think of any from Nikki at X Prize had a follow up to that? Can you think of any new programs or policies or tools that could help scale carbon removal startups? You touched on it a little bit, Chris, but maybe elaborate if you, each of you, if you could.
You said program, sorry, I think
programs.
You cut out on my end again. Programs,
sure.
Policies, and
tools.
Programs, policies, and tools. So I think Aaron brought up the LCA work Global CO2 initiative has been working on. That's really great. Like that's just, I recommend anybody who's thinking about this, you know, and building a business in carbon removal to take a look at that. That has been really important. For me, I think on the softer, you know, I'm also, again, thinking about innovation in business models. So I'm trying to think of, I'm used to VC funding and like equity funding and things of that nature. But one of the things that I'm looking at is, you know, like what does the Bob's Red Mill of carbon removal look like? You know, just thinking about like, what are some ways that we can share the wealth, that we can center social and economic justice as we're building new businesses in this space. And so I have particularly loved things like, I've loved Holly Jean Buck's writings on this. She recently published an article called Decolonizing the Air that I think is really good and really comprehensive and takes a really critical look at the ways that we can approach building businesses in this space. I also have enjoyed, I don't know, I've got a whole reading list that I could post to people that is, you know, I've got several books and articles that have been really indispensable in terms of the sort of socioeconomic justice angle. And I think like, maybe that's not what people are looking for in like a discussion about entrepreneurship, but I think it's important to center in this space.
I think that looking at the chat, there's interest in that reading list, Kristin. So
awesome.
One question, pivoting a little bit to markets and technologies. Besides, you know, question came up. Besides EOR, can you think of any really promising applications for or markets that you see for carbon products, or interesting, novel, promising sequestration ideas that you've discovered as a result of your work so far?
Yeah, so I'm more interested in carbon capture and utilization. I think without, you know, putting a price on carbon and really political leadership and a complete regime change in our executive branch, sequestration is, you know, from a market perspective, I don't really see how that, from a market-based approach perspective, I don't see how it necessarily works. So I'm really looking at, you know, trying to build a business that, you know, works on the balance sheet. So utilization is an area that's really promising to me. I think some of the challenges there goes into issues of permanence when you're talking about CO2 capture, and really industry. You know, I think there are a lot of, and particularly I've been looking at investigating converting carbon dioxide into commodity and specialty chemicals. So when you're talking about that, you're talking about competing with, you know, huge established institutions, you know, Dow Chemicals of the world. And these institutions, while they have come up with, you know, some, emissions reductions targets, they aren't necessarily, they seem pretty hollow. And from conversations that I've had, I've kind of learned that they are hollow. They don't necessarily have the plan behind the idea. So a lot of it really goes into trying to find the right market entry point, and doing what you can to commercialize a technology within some given time that is realistic for a VC. But I think in terms of like general markets, I really look at, I try to identify large chemical markets and large from a capital perspective, a market cap, and then also from a physical creation of products. So like, billions of tons. Because when you're talking about kind of like mass balancing from the CO2 feedstock to the end product, if my goal is to remove a gigaton of carbon dioxide or equivalent from the atmosphere at the 10-year mark, I also need to be able to have a product that is within that same kind of ballpark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, gosh, I love all of that. I'm gonna just, again, +1, especially from the lens of industrial biomanufacturing. I think that looking at, I mean, the entry point is really important, but I do imagine a world in which we're going to be able to achieve kind of some of the same economies of scale of production as some of the things that we make. So like polyurethanes, for instance, are in everything: coatings, foams, adhesives, etc. There are ways that you can create polyurethanes biologically from microorganisms or aggregates or composites of biological material that don't necessarily require petrochemicals as a feedstock. So one category that I look at is, where are the commodity and specialty chemicals that we can sort of displace petroleum from that supply chain? Where is that possible, particularly with biotechnology and biomanufacturing? The entry points that I look for in those markets are kind of like, the way that I frame this is, what is my Tesla Roadster chemical? And then, later on down the line, how do I build from there, from like a product that maybe the people on this call would be willing to pay a premium for, down the line to getting to that thing that instead of being $450 a kilo is $8 a kilo or $3 a kilo, that kind of commodity market. But understanding that it's going to be next to impossible to move into that market first, in the absence of regulations or incentives, a lot of which we don't have right now. So that's a big place that I look. Another place that I look is in the built environment. I think in terms of sequestration, we have opportunities to just kind of incidentally, as a matter of practice, store more carbon in concrete. So a lot of the companies that are thinking, okay, we want to use CO2 to make concrete instead of creating concrete that emits a ton of CO2 or several tons of CO2. That I think is really interesting. I think there's a big opportunity to sequester more carbon in the built environment. So if we're talking about that kind of technology, I think that's important. And I also am imagining, like, there are early markets, you're going to have to find an entry point, but I think there are interesting perspectives and like things to dream about where, I like the idea of reactive capture, right? So I like the idea of something where it's like you're going directly from CO2 into a chemical or into a product or into an aggregate, instead of I'm going to capture CO2 and then come out with a pure stream of CO2 and then do enhanced oil recovery, or try to take that pure stream of CO2 and then turn it into something else. So I'm also very interested in reactive capture. Enzyme-mediated reactive capture, I think, is super interesting, but it's unclear whether there's an early market for that. other means of biologically mediated reactive capture. And one other thing, because I'm interested in everything, but I've thought a lot about the miniaturization, decentralization, and massive parallelization of direct air capture technologies. So how can you can't cheat thermodynamics, but how can you create or leverage infrastructure that and sorbent technologies that might minimize the thermodynamic requirements of capturing CO2 directly from the atmosphere, and where might be some interesting places to put that technology, and what might be some interesting ways to build that technology. So that's a lot of different things. I do think that some of the more practical ones, I'm going to echo what Aaron said, are in utilization rather than in sequestration. I have a lot of hope that eventually we're going to get to the point where a very robust requirement for carbon offsets is a thing. And that means if you build a technology that's just sequestering carbon, that you're going to be able to make money doing that. I don't necessarily think that's true today, but with some of the large commitments we've seen from large corporations coming out, I think we're on the road to that becoming a reality. Unclear when, but yeah.
Thanks. So to follow up to your point about the distributed air capture, just as a point of fact, earlier this week we actually put up the videos from the conference where distributed direct air capture was from our AirMiners conference in May, where distributed air capture was a topic for one of the open spaces. So if people are interested, look to the AirMiners YouTube channel for a really fascinating, rich discussion about that particular type of development in carbon capture. One more question. We're getting toward the top of the hour. Pivoting toward investment and considering what elements of fundraising are most difficult, investor list building, connecting with investors, communicating with investors, sort of learning curve issues, and securing investment. Can you speak to any of those?
Sure. Well, I think if you're looking at like the capitalization of itself, you have a couple different buckets. A lot of these technologies still need research and development. So you want to go the grant route for that. And then when you're talking about, I think, being able to do customer discovery and have the runway for your business, traditional kind of VC angel investing routes is one. And then when you're talking about actually building the facilities and the plants, because there's hardware associated with that and all the CapEx, you need to look at project financing. So I think being able to have a knowledge base of each of those kind of areas is really important. And also being so centering yourself with folks in that space that have experience in it has been really helpful for me. We have one EIR who was a former VC and has done has built, I think, a solar plant on his own. So he was able to give me a good introduction into project financing and how to think about rates and returns. Joining other climate groups like My Climate Journey, I've been able to connect with a lot of angels and institutional investors who have kind of given me a roadmap for how to get the company itself funded. And then working with Carbon180 and all of the program directors over at DOE and ARPA-E to learn how to get the research funded has been, I think the pathway of getting started there and really getting that foundation in this space.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Kristin, thoughts?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, once again, +1 to all of that. And one of the things that I want to just say to people on the call that might be considering doing something like this is like, basically, I guess don't be shy, right? Like one of the things that I found, again, like this community is amazing. And like, I can just offhandedly mention to Tito, for instance, that I'm interested in talking to vaguely, like a person that's doing something sort of like knows something about like grant funding for small businesses, and like there will be a person that I can talk to who is like delighted that I emailed them, delighted to set aside time to talk to me about it. All of the people that I've tried to talk to about financing, be they angel investors, VCs, program managers, they've all been actually really accommodating, really friendly, really eager to talk about this. And there are a lot of people who want to deploy capital into this space and are looking for places to put it. And so I think there are funding challenges. That's not to say it's going to be easy and you're just going to be able to be like, hey, give me money, and people will give you money. Like, you need a solid foundation, but don't be shy and talk to people and ask those questions. Most of the people that I've talked to about this have been very, very open.
Great. And as speaking of open conversations about investing, this would be a really good time to mention, since we've got about 5 minutes left, that in 2 weeks' time, to further on some of the issues that Aaron and Kristin just mentioned, AirMiners is going to host an investor discussion panel similar to this, where we will be hearing from investors who are involved in seed, A, B rounds, or even later stage investments in carbon removal, to understand some of the drivers, barriers, and some of the things that they look for in carbon removal investments and how that field has developed over the years. So 2 weeks from today, so look to a link from that in the email that'll send out after we're done, so that you can register and sign up, and then we'll do this all again in 2 weeks' time. Before we go, though, I just wanted to first of all thank Aaron, Kristin, and Peter, and see if you had any closing statements or closing remarks that you wanted to share with the group.
This is difficult work, but it's not impossible. We got here from our need for energy and other resources, and we can get ourselves out of it. And then personally, as I mentioned, there's always challenges. So I'm going to do a quick ask. I'm not a technical person in nature, and I'm learning what I need to do to move my ideas forward along. But if you all know of any chemical engineers who are mission aligned and want to work on decarbonizing chemistry, let me know. And you can reach out to me through Twitter or LinkedIn or this AirMiners Slack group. So I look forward to hopefully having conversations with any and all of you. If you have questions about entrepreneurship in this space, or the EIR program, or even just like some of the many failures I've kind of gone into throughout this past year, I'm happy to share that.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to say ditto. As with the gifts that the community has given me so far, my door is also open. I cannot promise that I'm going to have exact answers for you on some things, but I do think that we can figure it out together. I'm happy to be very open about what I'm working on. And yes, like, if there is anything that I have mentioned that piques your interest, Aaron and I, we're going to hopefully be building companies, and we're going to need amazing, passionate people to work with. And so keep us in mind. And yeah, please do reach out.
I'd like to say just quickly, thank you, Jason and Tito, for hosting this conversation and for building such a great community.
Oh,
use
thank
the
you
Slack.
for being
Please
so
go to the
gracious with your
Slack,
time.
everyone.
Yes.
Use it. We need your voices there. It's dead. It's a ghost town without you. So come on by.
Yes. Thank you, Matthew. Matthew's point, yes, please go to Slack. Would love to hear any and all of your ideas. We've enhanced the Slack channels recently with new channels focusing on blue carbon, policy, stack, funding, events, all sorts of new interesting soil, new interesting specific groups, panels specific to the topics that we think are most pertinent to you as a community. So looking forward to seeing you all there. And in 2 weeks' time, we will do this all again with an investor panel that I heartily encourage you and invite you all to share in.